Hello, everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that essentially means is that I study the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I have for a very long time. And I'm generally speaking the kind of guy that you can come to with any sort of question about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it's The Hobbit, or The Lord of the Rings, or the Silmarillion, or any of its satellite stories, or any of other works or translations by him. And, if you want to ask me a question, you can just go ahead right there in the comment section and ask me a question, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Or if you want to be featured in a video, or if you feel that the answer to the question might be something too detailed or too long to go in a YouTube comment section, you want to use a website called Quora. So Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask any sort of question that you can think of and have people with, relevant knowledge or experience or wisdom or expertise answer you. And if you ask any sort of Tolkien question on Quora, you're going to get a list of people that you can tag, and my name will be at or near the top of that list. And of course, there is a link directly to my Quora account in the description of this video, as well as a link to my Quora space, The Grey Havens, which features all of my writing and a lot of other people's writing as well, and it's all Tolkien, not a general fantasy space. So anyway, the usual like and comment and subscribe and all that stuff, and I'll ask you to subscribe again at the end of the video. We have 11 questions to get through this week. But first, I'm going to do a reading, and, I thought that, I'm actually recording this on April 1st, or rather that it's going to be April 1st for the next 5 minutes or so, and I thought, well, what would be some sort of, almost an April Fool's joke, but not quite, and not that I'm really going to be fooling anybody here, especially that I've just said that it's a sort of an April Fool's theme thing, and I thought it would be fun to read a bit of The New Shadow. So if you're unfamiliar with The New Shadow is actually the sequel to The Lord of the Rings that Tolkien started writing, and he got a few pages into it, and then he quit, and he stopped writing it, and he basically gave his reasons that he felt that it was sort of depressing in the sense that he was writing a story set in the Fourth Age where magic had sort of left Middle-earth. There were no more wizards, there were no elves, and it was sort of this very sort of mundane story, and he just wasn't feeling it. He decided it was too depressing to write, too depressing to read, and he just wasn't interested in it at all. Anyway, if you're interested in it, it is in its entirety featured in the book The Peoples of Middle-earth, and I'm going to read you, we'll say, the first little bit of The New Shadow there. Here we go. This tale begins in the days of Eldarion, son of that Elisar of whom the histories have much to tell. 105 years have passed since the fall of the Dark Tower, and the story of that time was little heeded now by most of the people in Gondor, though a few were still living who could remember the War of the Ring as a shadow upon their early childhood. One of these was old Borlus of Pen Arduin. He was the younger son of Beregond, the first captain of the guard of Prince Faramir, who had removed with his lord to the city of the Emin Arnin. Deep indeed run the roots of evil, said Borlus, and the black sap is strong in them. That tree will never be slain. Let men hew it as often as they may. It will thrust up shoots again as soon as they turn aside. Not even at the feast of felling should the axe be hung on the wall. Plainly think you are speaking wise words, said Sauron. I guess that by the gloom in your voice and by the nodding of your head. But what is this all about? Your life seems fair enough still for an aged man that does not now go far abroad. Where have you found a shoot of your dark tree growing? In your own garden? Borlus looked up, as he glanced keenly at Sauron. He wondered suddenly if this young man, usually gay and often half-mocking, had more in his mind than appeared in his face. Borlus had not intended to open his heart to him, but being burdened in thought he had spoken aloud, more to himself than to his companion. Sauron did not return his glance. He was humming softly, while he trimmed a whistle of green willow with a sharp mail knife. The two were sitting in an arbor near the steep eastern shore of Andur. of Anduin, where it flowed about the feet of the hills of Arnen. There were indeed in Borlus's garden, and his small grey stone house could be seen through the trees above them on the hill slope facing west. Borlus looked at the river, and at the trees in their June leaves, and then far off to the towers of the city, under the glow of late afternoon. "No, not in my garden," he said thoughtfully. "Then why are you so troubled?" asked Ceylon. "If a man has a fair garden with strong walls, then he has as much as any man can govern for his own pleasure." He paused. "As long as he keeps the strength of life in him," he added. "When that fails, why trouble about any lesser ill? For then he must soon leave his garden at last, and others must look to the weeds." Borlus sighed, but he did not answer, and Ceylon went on. "But there are, of course, some who will not be content, and to their life's end they trouble their hearts about their neighbors, and the city, and the realm, and all the wide world. You are one of them, Master Borlus, and have ever been so ever since I first saw you as a boy, that you caught in your own orchard. Even then you were not content to let ill alone, to deter me with a beating, or to strengthen your fences. No, you aggrieved and wanted to improve me. You had me to your house and talked to me. I remember it well. Orcs' work, you said many times. Stealing good fruit, well, I suppose that is no worse than boys' work, if they are hungry or their fathers are too easy. But pulling down unripe apples to break or cast away, that is orcs' work. How did you come to do such a thing, lad? Orcs' work. I was angered by that, Master Borlus, and too proud to answer, though it was in my heart to say in a child's word, if it is wrong for a boy to steal an apple to eat, then it is wrong to steal one to play with. But not more wrong. Don't speak to me of orcs' work, or I may show you some. But it was a mistake, Master Borlus, for I had heard tales of the orcs and their doings, and I had not been interested till then. You turned my mind to them. I grew out of petty thefts. My father was not too easy, but I did not forget the orcs. I began to feel hatred and think of the sweetness of revenge. We played at orcs, I and my friends, and sometimes thought, shall I gather my bed and go cut down his trees? Then he will think the orcs have really returned. But that was a long time ago, Ceylon ended with a smile. Borlus was startled. He was now receiving confidences, not giving them. And there was something disquieting in the young man's tone, something that made him wonder whether deep down, as deep as the roots of the dark trees, the childish resentment did not still linger. Yet even in the hearts of Ceylon, the friend of his own son, and the young man who had in the last few years shown him much kindness in his loneliness, at any rate he resolved to say no more of his own thoughts to him. Alas, he said, we all make mistakes. I do not claim wisdom, young man, except maybe that little that one may glean with the passing of the years, from which I knew well enough the sad truth, that those who mean well may do more harm than those who let things be. I am sorry now for what I said, if it roused hate in your heart, though I still think that it was just. Untimely, maybe, but yet true. Surely even a boy must understand that fruit is fruit, and does not reach its full being until it is ripe, so that to misuse it unripe is to do worse than just to rob the man that has tended it. It robs the world, hinders a good thing from fulfillment, those who do not join forces with all that is amiss, and the blights, and the cankers, and the ill winds, and that was the way of orcs. And is the way of men too, said Ceylon. No, I do not mean of wild men only, or those who grew under the shadow, as they say. I mean all men. I would not misuse green fruit now, but only because I no longer have any use for unripe apples, not for your lofty reasons, Master Borlus. Indeed, I think your reasons are as unsound as an apple that has been too long in store. To trees, all men are orcs. Do men consider the fulfillment of the life story of a tree before they cut it down? For whatever purpose, to have its room for tilth, to use its flesh as timber, or fuel, or merely to open the view? If trees were the judges, would they set men above orcs, or indeed above the cankers and blights? What more right, they may ask, have men to feed on their juices than blights? A man, said Borlus, who tends a tree and guards it from blights and many other enemies does not act like an orc or a canker. If he eats the fruit, he does it no injury. It produces fruit more abundantly than it needs for its own purpose, the continuing of its kind. "Let him eat the fruit then, or play with it," said Ceylon. "But I spoke of slaying, hewing, and burning, and by what right men have to do such things to trees. You did not. You spoke of the judgment of trees in these matters, but trees are not judges. The children of the One are the masters. My judgment as one of them you know already. The evils of the world were not at first in the great theme, but entered with the discords of Melkor. Men did not come with these discords, they entered afterwards, as a new thing, direct from Eru the One. And therefore they are called his children, and all that was in the theme they have for their own good the right to use, rightly, without pride or wantonness, but with reverence." So I'm going to stop there because it's interesting, and you can kind of see where he's going. There's not really much more to this fragment of a story. The New Shadow is really just a fragment of the story of two men, one of which is related to a character from The Lord of the Rings. Of course, Borlus is the younger son of Beregond. He probably was not born during The Lord of the Rings. He might have been, and he might have already been sent away. But we know of Beregond and his young son that sort of hung around with Pippin for a while and showed him around the city and such. And this is saying that, well, he had a second son, and now he is in old age, because this is, over 100 years afterwards. And he's having this discussion about the nature of evil, and we're starting to see like a little bit of darkness in this guy that he's talking to, that is saying, I'm still not over that time you caught me stealing your apples, and you said that was like some real orc mess, and I was angry about that, and I used to want to be an orc, and the story would go on to sort of, come up with this idea of a sort of orc cult growing in men. And we see this sort of argument where he's saying, if you were stealing for food, that's one thing, but you were stealing these apples that weren't ready to eat just to throw them around, and that's wrong. And he's saying, well, they're, it's wrong either way, because stealing is stealing, but I wouldn't say it's more wrong. And they get into this philosophical debate. And what is interesting is that when Ceylon here goes into the whole idea of, well, who's to say that we could cut down trees, and they get into this philosophical debate. And Borlus here answers him with the idea that, well, all these things are put on Earth by the One, by Eru, or Ilúvatar, he might also call him, God. And they're there for us to use, and to do so in a productive way, in a proper way. And you can see a little bit of the thoughts of the author coming out. But what's interesting about it is that you don't hear this kind of talk in The Lord of the Rings. Nobody is mentioning the One or Eru or anything like that. The closest that anybody comes is when Faramir says that before a meal that they turn and sort of have like a silent prayer to face the west, to Númenor, that was, and Elvenhome beyond it, and what is beyond Elvenhome. And that's the closest that we come to sort of like religions existing in the Lord of the, in Middle Earth. In the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien was very insistent that he keep those sort of things out of the story. We understand that there are churches, there are cults, there are religious people and religious works and rituals and such in Middle Earth. It's just that it's mostly kept out of the story because it's not that sort of story. But even so, you think you would hear something about Eru, other than, Gandalf saying, I am a servant of the secret fire, or what is, beyond Elvenhome. And what's really interesting here is the reason that this sort of talk, because he mentions Melkor, and he mentions, some of the events of the First Age, is specifically because of Bilbo, because Bilbo, in his convalescence and his retirement in Rivendell, worked on translating a lot of the Elven lore into Westron, the common speech, because a lot of it was written in languages like Quenya. Now, in Gondor, they also spoke and could probably read Sindarin. However, not a lot of these works, which would become the Silmarillion, were written in Sindarin. They were written in probably a variety of languages, but almost certainly Quenya would be heavily represented there. The last part was probably written in Sindarin because it was probably Elrond writing that part. Although, I mean, he was more than capable of writing in Quenya as well, and of course Bilbo could read and translate both of them. And a lot of this, they got added to what they called the Red Book, and the Red Book was, sort of disseminated throughout Middle-earth. There were even some places that had like differing versions of it with, additions or subtractions or such. And so it's interesting that, yes, in the Fourth Age, you would probably see more of that type of talk, more of people having knowledge of what happened in the First Age, of what they used to call the deeps of time, and knowing their history a bit better, and it would all be because of Bilbo. So anyway, it's pretty interesting. Like I said, it's included in the book The Peoples of Middle-earth, and there's some notes on it, from Christopher Tolkien and whatnot. But that is, just the first little bit of J.R.R. Tolkien's The New Shadow, which is not very long at all. And it was abandoned, and you can kind of tell why he abandoned it, and you kind of tell where the story was going, and that it wasn't going to be as interesting as The Lord of the Rings, and it wasn't going to be as, fantastical or as magical, that it was going to be a fairly mundane tale. And Tolkien wasn't, he didn't like to read mundane tales, he didn't like to write mundane tales, so he gave up on that one. Anyway, we have 11 questions to get through, so let's get to your first question. Our first question comes in by the request of Casey Rummond, who asks, were there ever any elves who are half Sindar, half Ñoldor? Yeah, kinda. Sindar and Ñoldor are not races or breeds of elves. They are more akin to nationalities. So being, half Sindar, half Ñoldor is sort of like saying that you're half English, half Irish. It doesn't make you, any sort of different person, or that you might have any sort of different physical traits, but it's just what nations and what cultures your ancestors were from. What the question is really asking here, did any of the Ñoldor exiles ever marry Sindar elves? And the answer is, of course, yes. The most famous of these examples being Galadriel and Celeborn, and of course, they had a daughter, Celebrian, who they had three grandchildren, Elladan and Elrohir and Arwen. Now, the grandchildren of Galadriel and Celeborn were considered Perthel, which means half-elf, due to the fact that their father Elrond was a half-elf himself, being born of two half-elves. Tolkien wasn't big on dealing with like a lot of fractions because, like I said, it's not really, genetics in this case. There weren't like, quarter elves, or you couldn't be like 1/16th elf or anything like that. Anyone who was born that had mortal and elvish ancestry was considered Perthel, whether they were mortal or immortal themselves. Of course, there's sort of a limit on that because Elros, he was the first king of Númenor, and he was Perthel, of course, because he was, Elrond's twin brother. But, Aragorn, who is, this is 60 generations later, he's not considered Perthel, he's considered mortal man, though of a different stock, the Dúnedain. So I think that after a while, another example, here's a good one, is Prince Imrahil of Gondor. He had some Sindar, or actually I think Sylvan ancestry mixed in, and this was not even that far ago. It wasn't, in the Second Age, it was in the Third Age, just earlier on, but many lives of men have passed through then. So while Legolas was able to recognize that Imrahil had a little bit of elf in him, he wasn't considered half-elf. So there is sort of a cutoff. We don't know exactly when it is, but I think if you go back like 3 generations and there's no elves in your family tree, I would say at that point you're not half-elf anymore. So these designations, Ñoldor, Sindar, Teleri, Sylvan, they're just cultural divides, though. Elves choose to live the way that they will, and that's the culture that they are considered to be a part of. For the part of Galadriel, she was considered a Ñoldor woman, but her mother, Iarwen, was Falmar, which is a division of the Teleri, and her paternal grandmother was Indis, who was a Vanya. So she has Ñoldor, Vanyar, and Teleri ancestry, making her pretty much a hodgepodge of the three types of elves that took part in the Great Journey. But she was considered Ñoldor because that's the culture that she was raised in, and that's the culture that she practiced. Celeborn himself is always Teleri in every version of the story, though whether he is Sindar or Falmar is dependent on what draft of the story you're reading. Some versions that Tolkien considered had him as a Falmari prince that was already married to Galadriel in the Undying Lands and came over the Helcaraxa with her. And in the more accepted version, he was Sindar, who lived in Doriath and was likely a kinsman of Ilúthingol. Either way, he's Teleri. The functional difference between the Sindar and the Falmari is that the Falmari actually made their way to the Undying Lands, and the Sindar, they started the journey, but they didn't finish it. And even though not every Teleri that did not make it to the Undying Lands was Sindar, though, there were the Nandor, and then the Nandor were also divided further into the Sylvan and the Green Elves and such. So it all depended on, where they migrated to, where they settled to, and what their culture was. In the Third Age, you don't really hear a lot about these divisions. You hear of Wood Elves and High Elves, and the Wood Elves is sort of a catch-all term for anyone who's a Sindar, Sylvan, Nandor, or Laquende. Those are the Green Elves. While the High Elves are the ones that, come from the Undying Lands, the Ñoldor remnants like Galadriel and a lot of elves that have already left. Bilbo mentions in A Side to the Hobbit that the High Elves were divided into the Sea Elves, the Light Elves, and the Deep Elves, which is his descriptions for the Falmari, the Vanyar, and the Ñoldor, and that some of them came back into the wide world, which is his description of Middle-earth. Notice that in The Hobbit, the phrase Middle-earth is actually never used. The phrase the Shire is never used either. But anyway, in the end, we know of several important Ñoldor that came across the sea, whether by boat or by Helcaraxa, and some of them had spouses already, and some of them left their spouses behind. The only named Ñoldor that we absolutely know married a Sinda was Galadriel. But there were countless others that were unnamed, and it is reasonable to assume that some of them married into Sindar families, or Nandor families, or Sylvan families, or Laquenti families, and some of them didn't, and they married other Noldor, and then they had Noldor children, and then those Noldor children married Sindar elves. And one of the comments that came in here on Quora was from somebody named Bobe Fett, and they brought up an example of that happening. Because Aranwe was an elf he was an Oldo, and he lived in Gondolin, and he was considered to be somewhat related to Fingolfin in some way. He's of the house of Fingolfin, and he had married a Sindar elf that we don't know her name, but we just know that she was also somewhat related to actually Círdan, of all people. And their child was Varanwa, who is a fairly major character in the Fall of Gondolin. So there you have it. So for examples of named characters that are what you would say half Sindar, half Noldor, you would go to Varanwa for sure, and Celebrian. The thing is, Celebrian was considered to be, I believe she was considered to be a Sindar elf. Even though her mother was Noldo, because that's, where, the sort of culture that she grew up in and the culture that she adopted. Even at this point, even Galadriel is sort of living as a Sindar elf herself, so there's that as well, even though she's considered Noldo. And Varanwa was considered Noldo as well. So it's, like I said, it has everything to do with culture and not much to do with genetics or anything like that. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Danny Linder, who asks, could Ancalagon have destroyed the Silmarils? Quick answer is no. He couldn't have even have destroyed the One Ring, according to Gandalf. When the topic of possibly using Dragonfire to destroy the One Ring comes up at the Council of Elrond, Gandalf proclaims that while there were once dragons that could have melted the Rings of Power, and a few of them had been destroyed in this fashion, there were none of these dragons in the world that had that level of power anymore. He also mentions that there was never a dragon that could have destroyed the One Ring, not even Ancalagon the Black. This is important to note because we learn a bit later that there is a way to destroy the One Ring in Middle-earth. There may be additional ways to destroy it in the Undying Lands, but it couldn't go there. And that was at its point of creation, Mount Doom. So there was a way, albeit a pretty far-fetched way, that required a lot of work, an entire war fought to distract the enemy, and a string of miracles, essentially. But let's go back to that phrase, at the point of creation. That's relevant when we're talking about Silmarils. It was mentioned that no violence that existed in all the world could destroy a Silmaril. They could only be broken open by the cunning of their creator, Feanor, who may do this at the end of the world. However, though Ancalagon the Black did not exist yet at the point that this was said, and as a matter of fact, there were no dragons when that was said, let's look at the exact wording that Tolkien used. No violence could mar it or break it within the kingdom of Arda. So no violence could break them or even mar them, meaning that the most violent event possible in the world wouldn't even scratch one of the Silmarils. And this would include whatever the mightiest of the Valar, such as Melkor, could do to it, or even all of the Valar put together. And Calagon's flames against a Silmaril, or all the Silmarils for that matter, may be no more effective than the gentle flame of Frodo's hearth was to the One Ring, which was not even enough to warm it up. You know, when Gandalf dropped it in Frodo's hand, he said it is quite cool. It is not even heated up. It's not even warm from the flames. So it's sort of like that. That's what it would be like if Ancalagon was to breathe fire on the Silmarils. It would have absolutely no effect whatsoever. It wouldn't even change their temperature. All right, let's move on to the next question. This next question came in anonymously, and this is a rather simple one. What are the potential consequences if a Silmaril was dropped into Mount Doom? Nothing would happen. Nothing at all. As we talked about, they couldn't be destroyed. And one of them is already in a similar situation. Much as Gollum went careening into the fires of Mount Doom, clutching at the One Ring, so too did Mathros, son of Feanor, cast himself into a fiery pit in the earth, clutching at a Silmaril, and there it will remain until the end of the world. Tolkien entertained the idea of the lost Silmarils being found at the end, and even possibly being broken open and restoring the two trees, that this would come at the end anyway. The entire world was going to be essentially remade with a second creation free from evil. The Silmarillion mentions that, as I said in the previous one, no violence in the kingdom of Arda, which is the whole earth, could break or even harm a Silmaril, and this includes fiery pits and volcanoes and dragons and the Valar, everything. This could be open, they could only be opened up, not destroyed, but opened up by the craft of the one who forged them, because he's the only one that knows how to do it. So don't think of it as that he's just that powerful. You have to think of it as sort of like a puzzle box that only he knows how to open. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Jeremiah Michael Frown, who asks, why are the Hobbits extinct? According to Tolkien, they never went extinct. Hobbits are essentially an offshoot of the race of mortal men. They're half of our size, hence the descriptor halfling, though they don't like that term because they feel they're not half of anything. They're the proper size for them to be. They have furry feet, they have pointed ears, they live longer than we do. They aren't the only type of mortal man that diverge. There's the Druidan and the Giants. They were said to be mortal men of different sizes and shapes as well. Hobbits, though, they became more insular in the Fourth Age and beyond. We see parts of this as a reaction to the invasion of the Shire by Saruman, which they took care of with no outside help in an event known as the Scouring of the Shire. They were always notoriously shy of the big people, but going forward, we would become separated from our smaller kin more and more. Aragorn, the second Elisar, banned the big people from entering the Shire, though there were still hobbits that lived alongside of us in places like Bree. Eventually, they just retreated into their own spaces and they became invisible to us. And when I say invisible, I don't, of course, mean that they were literally invisible like Bilbo, putting on the One Ring, but that we just don't notice them. The Lord of the Rings refers to hobbits as unobtrusive, and that they used to be more numerous, and that they avoided us with dismay and are becoming hard to find. While they never studied magic, their natural trait of being able to hide is something that they're so adept at that we consider it to be magical. So in the paradigm of Tolkien's author's conceit that his stories were this mythological past, we can rest assured that hobbits are still out there. They're just avoiding us like the plague. All right, let's move on to the next question. Once again, we have a question from Danny Linder, who asks, is there an undisputed and definitive definition of a Valian year? No, surprisingly. There isn't. You often hear about the number 9.5. 9.5 to represent how many solar years a Valian year was like, or equal to. And this is often used in calculations in determining solar ages of people or things that were born or devised before the rising of the sun, the first rising of the sun. 9.5 is actually simplification. The calculation used to arrive there actually gets you the number 9.582. Then there's the fact that solar years are not exactly precise themselves, which is why we have leap years, a phenomenon that is absolutely observed in Middle-earth's calendars. This calculation is based on Tolkien's assertion in the book Morgoth's Ring that a Valian year was comprised of 1,000 Valian days, and that a Valian day, is comprised of 12 Valian hours, and that a single Valian hour was 7 of our hours, so you could calculate it from there, finding the year-to-year ratio of 1 to 9.582. This all seems pretty solid, but Tolkien changed his mind, as he often did, and though he made a precise ratio, he sometimes said that the length of the Valian years fluctuated between 9 and 10 years. This was his understanding in the 40s and most of the 50s. However, in 1957, he came up with the idea that the Valian years are actually much, much longer. So I'm going to read you a little bit from The Nature of Middle-earth. There are 12 tree hours in each Valian day, 144 days in each Valian year. But each Valian year equals 144 mortal years. Therefore, one Valian day equals one mortal year, and one tree hour equals approximately one mortal month. Time is recorded for mortal purposes during the days of the trees, thus, VY 100 V day, 136 V hour 9, the 9th month of the 136th sun year of the 100th Valian year. In Middle-earth, originally the Quendi appreciated and aged in 144 MY or yen as mortals in 1 MY. Therefore, when they went to Aman, they felt no change, but those who remained soon felt the necessary rate of mortality in aging. After the death of the trees and the ruin of Beleriand, the rate was about 12 years to 1 MY. So this note was written in 1957 and included in the book The Nature of Middle-earth, and we can see that Tolkien had the idea that a Valian year was 144 solar years. A similar thought had been included in The Lord of the Rings. I'm going to read you a brief bit here. It seems clear that the Eldar in Middle-earth, who had, as Samwise remarked, more time at their disposal, reckoned in long periods, and the Quenya word yen, often translated year, really means 144 of our years. The Eldar preferred to reckon in 6s and 12s as far as possible. A day of the sun they called Re, and reckoned from sunset to sunset. The yen contained 52,596 days. For ritual rather than practical purposes, the Eldar observed a week or enquia of 6 days, and the yen contained 8,766 of these enquia, reckoned continuously throughout that period. The fact that this is included in print in both the Lord of the Rings and the Nature of Middle-earth seems to make it, we'll say, canon that a Valian year is 144 solar years, especially as it was devised later than what he said that led to the 1 to 9.582 ratio. But of course, then later he changed his mind again, as included both in Morgoth's Ring and the Nature of Middle-earth. While Morgoth's Ring doesn't specifically bring this up, it mentions a revision that Tolkien was working on later in life, just before his death really, that the sun and the moon were in fact always there, and that the two trees and everything before it described in the Silmarillion was just elvish myth. This idea never made it into the Silmarillion, as it was not fleshed out enough. He didn't really write a lot about it, and it would invalidate so much of the text that it, was never revised by the author, unless of course we take them as just stories and not the actual history of Middle-earth. The Nature of Middle-earth goes into the ramifications of this change, though, and I'll read you a little bit of that. In a revised scheme in which the sun and moon are a primeval part of Arda, established before Arda was inhabitable, the basic time, even in Aemon, must be the sun year, since this governs all growth, be it slow, normal, or quick. But the Sunday need not be observed, since Valinor was domed over. So he comes up with the idea that sun years were always the measurement of time, but that a sun year was also referred to as a Valian day, and that the Valian year was 144, made of 12 months of 12 days each. This fixes the idea that the Valian year was 144 sun years, but because the Valar, for whatever reason, referred to an entire year as a day, Tolkien spends some time talking around the issue, trying to make the already published 144 years thing work with his idea that the sun was always around. So you may have, some people that prefer to go by his earliest ideas, as this means that we don't have to regard the Silmarillion as a load of nonsense, while others would state that yes, the flight of the Ñoldor really took centuries, not decades. This would also make Feanor an adult when his mother died. It recontextualizes the story and sometimes just outright changes it. Then, of course, we have those that, in my opinion, foolishly insist that the author's very last thoughts are the only ones that matter. So, Angband was on the moon, the two trees never existed. Personally, all this measuring gives me a headache, and I would prefer that people focus on what the story means, but that's just me. That's just my preference. You were interested in the answer, and there it is. There really is no definitive, undisputed definition of a Valian year. It's really up for debate. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question came in from Toasty Ghost Games, and I was just saying I like questions that, or thoughts, I should say, that really what the story means, and not so much measuring things. That's more of Matt's sort of thing. And this is one that I really like. What do you consider to be the most evil deed within Tolkien's Legendarium? So I love this question because it's soliciting an informed opinion. It's not asking me to tell you what Tolkien thought or what Gandalf thought or what the Valar thought. Tolkien, sort of has two different types of evil, two categories, great evil and petty evil. Great evil, this is your Dark Lords like Morgoth and Sauron. The actions of great evil are far-reaching and catastrophic. But still, in Tolkien's ideology, still a tributary to good, as the practitioners of great evil will inevitably bring forth good that they can't even conceive. Petty evil is more interpersonal, the cruelties and conflicts of everyday life. Petty evil has less catastrophic and less far-reaching impacts, but it might have a greater impact on an individual's life. It may feel more real and more pressing to them as they're small in the grand scheme of things, and they may not be looking at the whole picture and the whole of history. So one of the most interesting discussions of evil is in the Silmarillion. Manwë had, as all of the Valar had, been given the lesson that evil will lead to good. Ilúvatar said as much directly to Melkor, who was later called Morgoth, And he also relayed that lesson in a different conversation to Ulmo. Manwë tries to see the silver lining after the two trees had been destroyed, stating that they had been told that evil will lead to good. And then Namo, also called Mandos, he gives us the most concise reply, and yet remain evil. Namo gives us a very big cautionary warning here. Just because we know that evil will not prevail doesn't mean that we should welcome it. Evil acts are still evil, even if the result winds up being good in some way. There are a lot of things that people may point to as being the most evil, such as Melkor's original rebellion during the Ainur Lindala, the destruction of the two trees, the marring of Feanor, the entire plot of the Children of Húrin. There's a lot out there to pick from. For me, though, let's talk about the gift of man. The Children of Ilúvatar were something conceived in the third theme of the Ainur Lindala, and a mystery to the Ainur. There were two types. There were the firstborn, who the Ainur called the Eldar. They called themselves the Quendi, and we commonly refer to them as elves. Then there were the aftercomers, the mortal men. The Ainur had at least some understanding of elves, as elves were like them. They were newly awoken and growing in population, but they were still bound to the world as the Ainur were, persisting until the end of the world. They were different. They were incarnates, meaning that their bodies were actually them. They weren't like clothes that they wore. The bodies of the Ainur could be damaged as clothes could be damaged, and they could be destroyed as clothes could be destroyed, but it wasn't them. They were 100% spirits. Elves, however, were half spirit, half body, and the body couldn't live without the spirit. And if the body was damaged, the spirit could not inhabit it. They came up with a system for rehousing those lost spirits in new bodies, but this is to show that even though the Ainur could identify with elves, they were still fundamentally different in a major way. Men, however, they were not like the elves, different in a way that the Ainur never really grasped. We are temporary. Men grow old, they get sick, they die. If our bodies are damaged heavily, we leave the world. Out of all of the Ainur, only Namo is the one that knows the route, the path that we take when we leave the world. And he doesn't know what the destination is. Only God himself, called Ilúvatar or Iru, knows this. So this idea of death, this is something that's new to the Ainur. They had issues with even plants and animals being temporary. This is why they made the flora and fauna of the Undying Lands as immortal as they were, down to the last blade of grass. But they were forbidden to interfere with the doom of the Children of Ilúvatar. One of the Valar broke this fundamental law in a sort of loophole way, and of course it was Melkor, because of course it was Melkor. Death is referred to as the gift of man, because we go somewhere else, possibly somewhere wonderful, and the elves have to stay here in this world as the Ainur have to stay here in this world until its long conclusion. Elves are so hardy that Tolkien states that it would take them 10,000 centuries to become weary of the world, but eventually they would wish that they could depart like we do, and even the Ainur themselves would eventually become tired and wish to depart from the world, but they cannot. The one exception to elves, fully born elves, not the Perithel who have mortal ancestry, leaving the world was Luthien, by divine grace of Ilúvatar. And the only one of the Ainur to leave the world was Melkor. He was essentially kicked out of it. He was expelled from Arda. But so much of him is left behind in the earth itself that he might as well still be here. That's the concept of Morgoth's ring. That is, his essence imbued in the earth, most especially in Middle-earth. So why is it that we are afraid of death? If we know that we're going to leave the world and go somewhere, but that our spirits, still persist even if we don't have bodies, why is that we think that's so bad? The elves and even the angels will eventually wish they could die, so why is death bad? Melkor couldn't mess with the doom of man in the way that he can't stop us from dying, although through necromancy we can linger for an uncomfortable amount of time. So he did something that might even be worse. He made us afraid of death. In The Lord of the Rings, Tom Bombadil refers to a time when there was nothing to fear. He knew the dark under the stars when it was fearless, before the Dark Lord came from outside. Bombadil is essentially telling Frodo how old he is. He was in the world before Melkor was, and the dark was fearless. Compare this to a conversation between Melkor and Hurin. I am the elder king Melkor, first and mightiest of all the Valar, who was before the world and made it. The shadow of my purpose lies upon Arda, and all that it is in it bends slowly and surely to my will. But upon all whom you love my thought shall weigh as a cloud of doom, and it shall bring them down into darkness and despair. Wherever they go, evil shall arise. Whenever they speak, their words shall bring ill counsel. Whatsoever they do shall turn against them. They shall die without hope, cursing both life and death. The lie here is that Melkor created the world. Of course, he had a hand in the creation of the world, as did all the Ainur, and his hand was the greatest, as of the Ainur at least, as all of his thoughts were put into creation. But this was by the grace of Iluvatar, who chose which thoughts from each angel to put into his creation, and chose to use all of Melkor's thoughts to teach him a lesson that he has not yet learned. He is essentially telling Hurin, I'm God. But of course Hurin knows that this is not true, so here's a little bit of Hurin's response. Do you forget to whom you speak? Such things you spoke long ago to our fathers, but we escaped from your shadow. And now we have knowledge of you, for we have looked on the faces that have seen the light, and heard the voices that have spoken with Manwë. Before Arda you were, but others also, and you did not make it. Neither are you the most mighty, for you have spent your strength upon yourself and wasted it in your own emptiness. No more are you now than an escaped thrall of the Valar, and their chain still awaits you. So Melkor is rebuked by Hurin, who states Melkor wasn't alone, he didn't create the world, and he's no longer the most mighty because he's expended too much of his power into evil. He recounts that Melkor spoke such lies to our fathers. He goes on to say that Melkor is, in the end, powerless over man because they leave the world, and Melkor cannot pursue them beyond the circles of the world. Melkor ends the conversation with one last lie. Beyond the circles of the world I will not pursue them, said Morgoth, for beyond the circles of the world there is nothing. But within them they shall not escape me, until they enter into nothing. So the idea that there is nothing beyond death is what creates the fear of death, and it is a lie told to men by Melkor. Hurin here does not believe him, but there are many men who do, and some will go through extraordinary lengths to extend their lives in this world. I just look at the fall of Numenor. In Numenor, the gift of long life, already thought of as not enough by some of these men who feared death, was starting to wane due to their loss of faith, and in comes Sauron, who tells them that turning to worship of Melkor and making a temple to him and burning men as sacrifices to him in this temple, and this is the way that they can regain their lost gift. And of course that just makes it worse. And he tells them that they can become immortal by conquering the Ainur, and this leads to the downfall of their entire civilization and the breaking of the world. Men like Pharazôn were not as brave as Hurin. They feared death and destroyed themselves and everything around them out of their fear. So it is my thought that the single most evil act was Melkor making us fear the darkness beyond the world, telling us that there's nothing beyond the world and that death is the end. All right, let's move on to your next question. Our next question comes in from Matthew O'Dowd, who asks, if Denethor knew that the ring was going to Mordor, why didn't Sauron discover this when Denethor used his Palantír? Well, the Palantír is a tool of communication. It's not a tool of mind reading. Denethor was not Sauron's ally, nor was he his puppet. He did owe a part of his madness to speaking to Sauron, who made him believe that he would lose the war, and also to the death of Boromir. Denethor states that what matters to him the most is ruling the city his way, with no interference from others. He considers Gandalf an interference, and knows that after he's gone, Faramir will be the wizard's pupil. and in Gandalf's pocket. Or, of course, Gandalf could rule through his puppet Aragorn. Of course, Gandalf has no interest in ruling, and he tells Denethor this, but this is what the steward thought. And with the death of his wife and his possible death coming at the hands of Sauron, he saw it as the end of Gondor's independence. Anyway, onto the Palantír. Think of them like a video call. You can show the other person yourself or images that you have devised, but you cannot read their secret thoughts. You only hear what is projected with intent by the other person. This doesn't mean that you can't observe otherwise. Sauron knew that Saruman was lying to him. Not because the Palantír allowed him to hear Saruman's secret thoughts, but because Sauron just can tell when a person is lying. Aragorn offers him no lies, only allows Sauron to jump to conclusions, which turns out to be false conclusions. In the case of Denethor, we don't know what he said to Sauron, or even if he said anything at all. He certainly would never tell anything to Sauron that would give the Dark Lord an advantage. He's not out to help the guy, Not even if the Dark Lord offered him his life as a reward for information, because of my earlier point, Sauron is an interference in Denethor's wish to rule the city on his own terms in peace. The guy doesn't even trust Gandalf. He's certainly not going to trust Sauron, who is openly hostile to him. Denethor's weakness was that he trusted his willpower enough to test it against Sauron, and he was broken. But not in a way that made him a thrall or a servant, but that he was made weaker for it. He despaired. But he did not tell the Dark Lord where the One Ring was. He was of the belief that it should have been kept safe away from Sauron, an opinion also held by Boromir, his son, and that bringing it to Mordor was foolish simply because it may lead to Sauron recovering it. He would never tell Sauron where it was or where it was headed or who had it or where it was last seen. If anything, he would probably lie, and Sauron would probably know that he was lying, which brings me to my final point. It is my opinion that Denethor didn't actually speak to Sauron, but that Sauron was the one who did all the talking in this communique. Aragorn also did not speak to him, merely showed him the Ring of Barahir and the Sword of Elendil and the Elisar. I believe that Denethor too would not actually speak to Sauron, and that their communication was just very one-sided. He may have had the same opinion as Boromir, but he was wiser than Boromir, so he would not boast or try to challenge the Dark Lord or try to deceive him as Sauron did. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Mason T, who asks, had Sauron not created the One Ring, would he have been unbeatable? How could he have been stopped? So there's a theme in The Lord of the Rings of the great powers withdrawing and leaving men to inherit the world and take care of it. This is important, as it demonstrates, well, yes, Sauron could have been stopped by other means, but it wouldn't make sense for the story. It should be noted that while the One Ring falling into the hands of Sauron's enemies represented a unique and a likely one-time only opportunity for them to put a final end to his threat, the reason that it was able to fall into anyone else's hands at all was because he was defeated once already, ring and all. Now, you can, of course, make the argument that there are no direct analogues to Elendil and Gil-galad in the Third Age, no historic grand alliance of elves and men. But my point stands that Sauron with the ring can be defeated and has been defeated. Sauron, before he made the ring, was defeated as well, as he got it in his head at one point that the prophecy that stated that Huan could only be killed by the greatest werewolf meant that Sauron could defeat him in werewolf form, and he was pretty soundly trounced by the Hound of Valinor and further humiliated by Luthien, who was powerful enough to put Morgoth himself to sleep. The thing is, no matter how many times Sauron is defeated, he eventually comes back. Even when fighting the Last Alliance, he was coming back from his most devastating defeat and his most triumphant victory, the Akallabêth, where he facilitated the further fall of Numenor, which was already started, but Sauron made it so much worse, and he got God himself to smite the entire continent out of existence. And he didn't even mind that much that he was there at the time. He knew he would survive. Sauron even survived the destruction of the One Ring, but he was made so weak that he could never return to power. As an angel, albeit a fallen one, he can never really die. But now he's reduced to a state that all he could do is look on and watch the world go on without his influence. Now, onto the themes. We're seeing in The Lord of the Rings the elves departing, though some lingered through the Fourth Age, and even the likes of Círdan and Celeborn eventually departed. Galadriel and Gildor represented the last of the Ñoldor remnant, while many of the best and wisest of the other types of elves would depart. What elves were left would live in the woods and not concern themselves with men. Dwarves, even as they reclaimed their former glory and refounded Moria successfully in the Fourth Age, would eventually vanish from history, perhaps one day just deciding not to see the light of day. Hobbits became harder to find, we talked about this earlier, leaving Middle-earth to men. Hobbits are a type of men themselves, and this is important. Frodo's Chronicle is the downfall of the Lord of the Rings and the Return of the King. It's a two-part title. The downfall of Sauron is at the hands of the little people, primarily Frodo and Sam and Gollum, who destroyed the One Ring, while the titular king is Aragorn II Elessar, reuniting a lost kingdom. We see Gandalf withdraw, leaving the hobbits to topple Saruman on their own, and Aragorn recognizes their autonomous nature to the point where all of the big people, including himself, were banned by law from entering their territory. This started even in the Second Age. When it came time for the Valar to take a hand in the final defeat of Morgoth, they sent grand armies of elves and Maiar led by Eonwë himself. When it came time for them to interfere in the Second Age, they sent 2 Maiar incarnated into frail bodies, wizards, and an elf. And then later in the Third Age, they sent 3 more wizards. No grand armies, no unfettered Maya, just, some wizards and a single elf of great power, though with the mission specifically not to lead, but to assist Gil-galad and Elrond. Gil-galad dies, Elrond sails to the west, Galadriel sails to the west, the dwarfs retreat, the hobbits become insular. This section of Middle-earth that we're familiar with becomes Europe over a period of ages. If Sauron had recovered the One Ring, he, of course, could have been stopped, but to stop him permanently would mean the Valar taking a much more direct approach. And they knew that it wouldn't even work, because the moment that, even Eonwë steps on Middle-earth, much less one of the Valar, Sauron just hides at that point, and he doesn't show his face until he knows that they're gone. Even if he loses the war without intervention from the West, he bides his time and he eventually returns when his enemies are even weaker. So basically what I'm getting at is if he recovered the ring, it just meant that the one chance to stop him for good was gone, but it doesn't mean that he couldn't be defeated. He could be defeated, it's just that he would just bide his time and come back. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Hal Santos, who asks, if Gandalf had died a second time as Gandalf the White, do you think he would have been brought back a second time by Eru? I would say that he wouldn't need to be brought back by Eru, specifically, a second time. Gandalf's death was unusual. He passed from the world, something that was not meant to happen. There are essentially 3 kinds of true life in the world: the Ainur, the firstborn, and the aftercomers. The aftercomers are mortals. They have a limited time in the world, and then they pass from it upon death. Sometimes they're slain or they die before their time is up, and they wait in Mandos before, their time is done. The firstborn are the elves. They're immortal. They're bound to the world. If they die, their spirit goes to Mandos, and then they can get a new body, and they can return unless Namo, the doomsman of the Valar, decides to hold them there. But they cannot pass from the world without intervention from Ilúvatar or Eru himself. The Ainur are the angelic beings that entered into this world after its creation, and there were some of the same that had sung in the Ainulindala, the Song of Creation. They are the Valar and the Maiar, and Gandalf, or Olorin as he was originally called, is one of them. The Ainur are bound to this world much as the firstborn, and cannot pass from it without direct intervention from Ilúvatar. The only Ainur ever to leave the world are Morgoth and Gandalf. Morgoth was essentially expelled from the world and thrust into the void beyond creation, but so much of his essence is still in the world, most particularly Middle-earth. A large portion of him is still here. Middle-earth is Morgoth's ring. Gandalf, however, left the world and then was returned, and this was not usual. The main difference between the Ainur and the firstborn is their bodies. The firstborn are incarnates. the Ainur are not. The Ainur can have bodies, as we see with Sauron, for example, and change their bodies like clothes, or cast off their body and suffer no reduction to themselves. Their body can be attacked and damaged, as someone could tear your clothes, but your clothes are not you. In some rare cases, the Ainur can become incarnates. This happened to Morgoth at one point when he became too weak to change forms, and it happened to the wizards. The wizards are voluntarily incarnated into real bodies, meaning that they can now feel pain, they hunger, thirst, fatigue, and they can suffer wounds and even die. This was partly to limit their powers in Middle-earth and partly to help them identify with the incarnates that they were sent to inspire. However, though their bodies are somewhat, mortal, they do age, though very slowly, they are not mortal men. They are not meant to pass from the world. Saruman, when he was killed by Grima, rose from his destroyed body, which quickly withered to bones, an act of Manwë to prevent him from ever attempting to inhabit it again, and his spirit rose from his destroyed body and looked to the west to be rebuked by a cold wind, and then sighed and dissipated on the wind. Saruman was dead in the sense that he lost his body, and he had not the power or the authority to construct a new one, but he did not pass from the world. Much like Sauron, he was stuck in this diminished state until the end of the world. Gandalf passing from the world was an exception, divine intervention from Ilúvatar, who was the only one with the power to remove him from Arda, and the only one who could send him back empowered. It is suggested that he would be a lot harder to kill the second time around. Gandalf stated that he was the most dangerous being in Middle-earth, aside from Sauron himself. He also stated that Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas did not have any weapons that could harm him, which is interesting as Aragorn was carrying a sword that had once slain Sauron. This tells us that Gandalf was essentially under Ilúvatar's protection. It would take quite a lot to actually kill him. Still, if he were to die at this point, he wouldn't pass from the world. That was not a usual occurrence, and it was a one-time thing. If his body was somehow damaged to the point that he could not inhabit it, he might face a major setback at this point, and he would have to have his body withered by Manwë, and receive a new one, which would require a trip to the Undying Lands, so it would kind of mess up the whole timeline of the war. But there you have it. All right, let's move on to your next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Danny Linder, who asks, did Tolkien ever explicitly compare the Akallabêth to Sodom and Gomorrah? He did not. Comparing the Akallabêth to Sodom and Gomorrah is what the author would refer to as an application, meaning that it is an idea of the reader and a valid interpretation, but not something that was his own intention, which would make it an allegory. Tolkien disliked allegory. He disliked apologetics. He found weaving religious lessons into writing to be distasteful and crass. He did mean for his work to be, in his own word, didactic, as in teaching a moral lesson, but not specifically a religious one. A lot of his thoughts on this sort of thing can be found in Letter 131, which is one of Tolkien's best and most illuminating letters sent to Peter Hastings, the proprietor of a Catholic bookstore, who chided him for bad theology. Interestingly, Tolkien never actually sent the letter. He wrote it, but he never sent it, and it was one of his very best. It's the letter that I come back to more than any other. The analog of the Akallabêth should be noted in the linguistics that are involved. Akallabêth is from a language called Adonaic or Númenorian. It's a language devised in Númenor towards the end of their civilization, and Akallabêth means the downtrodden. It is what they called Númenor after the fall. In Elvish, the same word is Adelante, although sometimes I see it as Adelanta and sometimes I see it as Adelantia. Tolkien derived this from the Quenya Elvish talat, which is a verb root meaning to slip or fall down, and he was very pleased that the resulting word sounds like Atlantis, as Plato's hypothetical lost continent was the inspiration for Numenor. Before Numenor was ever connected to Tolkien's greater mythos, it was created for a story that he never finished called The Lost Road. And this was a part of a writing challenge between himself and C.S. Lewis to write a science fiction story. The story involved time travelers going back to an ancient lost land called Numenor. He didn't finish the story, but he came to realize that what he really wanted was, in his own words, alteration of the Atlantis myth and or tradition, and accommodation of it to my general mythology. And so the time travel ideas were stripped out, and Numenor became the Atlantis of the legendarium. Now, if you somehow, if you were a time traveler yourself and you had Tolkien in front of you and you asked him about, the Sodom and Gomorrah thing, he would probably, nod and smile and tell you that if you wish to view it that way, he won't stop you, but that he personally was thinking of Atlantis. All right, let's move on to the last question. Our final question came in from Danny Linder. Just like last week, he's sort of just going completely ham with the questions, but a lot of them are very good questions. And this final question is, what did more damage, the Silmarils or the One Ring? So this is one of those questions that I think the answer is wholly dependent on the reader's point of view. The term did more damage is a curious one. We must ask, direct damage or indirect damage? With intention or without intention? So, examining the first choice, the One Ring certainly did more direct damage than the Silmarils. The One Ring was created specifically as a tool to enslave others, and in the hands of Sauron for thousands of years he caused strife in Middle-earth. Even after the Dark Lord was parted from it caused damage. The death of the High King Isildur and its subsequent loss, followed by a murder immediately after being discovered, the marring of Bilbo, all the horrible things that Frodo and Sam, had to go along with, the insanity of Boromir and his death, all directly caused by the One Ring. Also directly is the creation of the Nazgul. Looking at the second choice, though, once again the first option, with intention, that favors the One Ring. The One Ring had a will of its own, and it was malevolent and caused the harm to Isildur and Bilbo and Frodo, and to a lesser degree it failed with Sam, but the intention was there. It was created as an instrument of evil. It had no good applications. The lesson that good cannot use the One Ring without doing evil was ingrained in the Lord of the Rings from, the very first chapter and onward. So by merit of direct damage inflicted as well as damage intended by both the entity itself and its creator, the One Ring is the clear winner. However, if we choose the second option, indirect damage and damage without intent from the entity or its creator, the Silmarils become the clear winner. The Silmarils did a bit of direct damage in the burning of the wicked that touched them due to being hallowed by Varda. Melkor is the first to feel this as his hand is burned by the Silmarils, even though he had them in a container. When Kacharoth swallowed it, one of the Silmarils, he was harmed, and more on that in a little bit. And both Maglor and Mathros were burned by the Silmarils that they took from the camp of Eanwa. After this, two were essentially rendered inert in the earth and the sea, and the other is carried in the sky by Elendil. That is the whole extent of the direct damage of the Silmarils, though some may argue the shortening of Lúthien's life should be considered, though I would say that I wouldn't count the shortening of her life as being damage, because she died alongside Beren. The indirect toll, though, is staggering. Kacharoth is a small example. The pain he felt, which was direct damage from swallowing one of these gems, but going insane from rage caused him to run straight through the girdle of Melian and cause havoc there. This led to his fight with Beren and both of their deaths, though Beren was resurrected. That is one example, but a bigger example is just everything, nearly everything, from their theft onwards, even to the end of the Third Age and the fall of Sauron. I could list examples until the Balrogs come home, but think of this. Without the Silmarils, there would be no Ñoldor in Middle-earth, no Rings of Power, no One Ring, no fall of Sauron, no lust for the One Ring indirectly, let's talk about the One Ring. The lust for the One Ring indirectly caused harm. Saruman, he never even saw the One Ring, but he had lust for it. It's a pretty, major indirect damage, but it's nothing compared to what lust of the Silmarils did, including Melkor stealing them in the first place. Literally every event from the darkening of Valinor on down to the One Ring's destruction was caused because some people, and some angels alike, wanted these 3 jewels so badly that they were willing to cause untold mayhem. Consider the Oath of Feanor, the migration to Middle-earth, the kinslayings. Consider Feanor's speech inspiring Galadriel to go to Middle-earth even though she didn't care about the Silmarils. Consider the War of Wrath, the creation of Numenor, its fall, the Akallabêth, which was the single most devastating event of the world, all because of the Silmarils. The very fact that without the indirect damage of the Silmarils, there wouldn't even be any rings of power at all tells you everything. And none of it was by the intent of the entity, as the Silmarils were not alive. They have no will. Their burning is the will of Varda, but this falls under direct damage. Their creator, Feanor, he wasn't exactly a nice guy, but he didn't create them for evil. He created them for a selfish reason, to pay tribute to his own skill and do something that even the Valar could not. But he did not intend for them to cause anyone any damage. So on the one hand, if we think of things one way, the One Ring was far more destructive in terms of doing direct damage. But if we count indirect damages, then the Silmarils come out on top. Okay, so a lot of great questions this time, and even one that, like I said, the measurement one about the times and the Valian Years, not exactly my cup of tea, but I had fun doing the research for it anyway. I had to cut myself off after a while because I was like, I could really feel myself going down a rabbit hole that will give me a headache, and that, maybe Matt would enjoy it more. But it was still a question that I wanted to answer, so there is that. I don't have to answer every question that comes through. I do pick and choose, the very best ones. But thank you for sending me questions, and thank you for the continued support. And I'm going to ask that if you've reached the end of this video, that you subscribe if you haven't already. And if you have subscribed, double check, make sure you're actually still subscribed, because sometimes people get randomly unsubscribed on YouTube. And if you feel like supporting me in a more direct fashion, consider membership. There is a button that says join, and also if that button for whatever reason doesn't work, because sometimes it doesn't work, there is a link in the description. I think it's the very first thing in the description of my videos, where you can join. And joining, it costs a little bit of money. It's $5 a month, but it's really not all that much, and it helps me out a great deal. You get to see all the videos early, and you get some other perks, especially related to live streams, which we are going to be doing more and more of. It's not going to become like an every Thursday thing, but it is definitely going to be more than 2 Thursdays a month, so there is that. So anyway, guys, leave me some comments, say hi, ask me some questions or whatever. I'll see you guys next time.